In the summer of 2017, Lucas Avery, a 34-year-old park ranger, was stationed at Kings Canyon National Park in California. He bunked in one of the historic Grant Grove cabins, simple wooden structures nestled among ancient sequoia trees. Lucas had seen his fair share of long hikes, search and rescues, and the occasional startled bear sighting. But for the most part, it was quiet work, surrounded by fresh air and solitude. That night started like any other. After logging his evening patrol and grabbing a quick bite, he changed into sweatpants and a t-shirt ready to turn in. But what came next? A frantic knock at his cabin door and two terrified women on his porch would shatter any sense of peace he had ever known. Just as Lucas reached for the light switch, a sharp, frantic knocking rattled the wooden door. It wasn't the casual kind of knock from a lost hiker. It was urgent, desperate. He pulled on his boots without bothering to change out of his sleep clothes, grabbed his flashlight, and opened the door. Standing before him were two young women, both visibly shaken. One clutched her shoulder, blood seeping through a jacket tied tightly around the wound. Her friend looked equally distraught, eyes wide and breath shaky. Without asking a single question, Lucas guided them inside and flipped on the cabin light. The injured woman dropped to her knees, while her friend tried to support her, struggling to stay calm. Lucas knelt beside them, gently unwrapping the makeshift bandage. What he saw made his stomach tighten, a deep bite wound, ragged and raw. But this wasn't from a bear or mountain lion. The pattern was wrong too, rounded too human. As he looked up, one of the women whispered, "He came out of nowhere. A naked man. He chased us and then bit her." Lucas's pulse quickened. Something was terribly wrong. Lucas listened closely as Jenna, the uninjured woman, tried to explain what had happened. She spoke between shaky breaths, her voice still trembling. The two had been walking a loop trail near Meadow Ridge just before nightfall. They'd heard footsteps behind them, slow at first, then faster. When they turned, a man completely naked charged from the trees without a word. He slammed into Sierra, knocking her to the ground, and before either of them could scream, he'd sunk his teeth into her shoulder like some wild animal. Jenna had kicked him hard, square in the groin, and somehow that gave them just enough time to scramble to their feet and run. But even after being doubled over in pain, the man had gotten back up and chased them again through brush and branches, all the way toward the cabins. Lucas could feel his training kicking in, even as his heart pounded. He radioed his coworker, Tom Delgado, and told him to come immediately. Tom arrived within minutes. Lucas gave him a clear order: stay with the girls, protect them no matter what. Then, Lucas grabbed his sidearm, pulled on his ranger jacket, and stepped into the night. Alone, with his duty belt secured, pistol holstered, and flashlight in hand, Lucas stepped out into the cold night air. The forest, usually filled with the soothing chorus of crickets and distant rustling, felt different, silent, expectant. The trail near the cabins led toward a meadow that the girls said they'd run through. Lucas followed it, keeping his steps deliberate, steady. He scanned the tree line with his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness in shaky streaks. Every few feet, he stopped to listen. Then a rustle. Quick, erratic movement in the underbrush. He swung the light. Nothing, just branches swaying. He moved closer. Another sound, this time to his left. He turned and caught a flash of something pale darting between trees. His breath caught. It was him. Naked, fast, and disturbingly agile. The man wasn't charging. He was circling, watching. Lucas shouted, "Stop!" but the figure bolted. Lucas gave chase, flashlight bouncing, pistol drawn but low. The terrain was rough, and the disorienting beams of light made it hard to track. He lost sight of the man briefly until he reappeared much closer. Lucas barely had time to react before the man lunged, slamming into him with terrifying force. They hit the ground hard. Lucas's flashlight flew from his grip, and he felt the man's hands clawing at his arms. The breath on his face was hot, ragged. The attacker was strong, wild. Lucas fought to free one arm. His training took over. He raised his pistol and fired. The sound of the gunshot cracked through the trees, sharp and final. Lucas felt the jolt in his wrist as the trigger pulled, and instantly, the man's body went limp. A deep groan escaped him, and his grip loosened just enough for Lucas to push him off, heart pounding. Lucas scrambled to his feet, retrieved his flashlight, and aimed both light and pistol at the attacker, now curled on the ground, clutching his abdomen. Blood was seeping through his fingers, but Lucas didn't relax. His hands trembled slightly, adrenaline surging, but he kept the weapon trained as he radioed in his location and situation. The man, still naked, still groaning, made no further moves to resist. Lucas carefully approached, avoiding the blood, and managed to cuff him without a struggle. The forest moments ago, a scene of chaos, now returned to an eerie quiet. Within minutes, backup arrived, rangers, paramedics, flashing lights, slicing through the trees. Sierra was treated and stabilized. The bite wound was deep and would require stitches and maybe rabies shots, depending on toxicology. As for the man, he was loaded onto a stretcher and taken into custody. Days later, Lucas learned his name, Raymond Chase. The toxicology report revealed a disturbing mix of synthetic drugs and hallucinogens. But in that moment, none of that mattered. The only thing Lucas knew was that he had survived barely, and that the women were safe. Still, as he washed the dirt and blood from his hands back at the cabin, he knew he'd never forget what had happened in that forest. In the days that followed, the story made its way through park channels but never hit the news. It was handled quietly internally, just another unpredictable incident in a place that knew how to swallow secrets. Raymond Chase was charged with aggravated assault and unlawful possession of a controlled substance. Lucas testified during the investigation, though he wasn't eager to relive every detail. What stayed with him more than anything was the letter that arrived a week later, handwritten and signed by both Sierra Manning and Jenna Cross. They thanked him and Tom for acting without hesitation for keeping them alive. Lucas kept the letter in the top drawer of his desk alongside old trail maps and a worn field guide. He didn't read it often, but he never threw it away. It reminded him that sometimes doing the job meant stepping into the dark literally and not flinching. That single night redefined what it meant to serve. He wasn't just protecting land or wildlife. He was protecting people too. And though he'd handled close calls before lost hikers, minor injuries, this one was different. This one had teeth. Even after the paperwork was done and Chase was behind bars, Lucas knew the forest wouldn't ever feel quite the same again. That night stayed with Lucas Avery long after the case was closed. He never spoke much about it, not because he was ashamed or shaken, but because he couldn't quite explain how it changed him. After the adrenaline wore off, he'd sat on the edge of his bunk in sweatpants, torn from the scuffle, staring at the wall, while the forest outside slipped back into silence. The quiet had never bothered him before, but now it felt heavier, like it knew what had happened and chose not to speak of it. Lucas never saw the women again, but he hoped they healed physically and emotionally. As for him, the experience didn't make him more paranoid, just more aware, more sober about the fact that danger doesn't always come with warning signs or glowing eyes in the dark. Sometimes it walks on 2 feet, and when it does, someone has to be ready. That's what it means to wear the badge, not just to patrol trails, but to be a protector when no one else is there. Back when Raymond Carlisle was living near the Canadian border in Michigan, he struck up an unlikely friendship with a man named Dean Harlow. They met at a small dive bar called Rusty's, a place where the jukebox only played Springsteen and the bar top never quite lost its stickiness. Dean was quiet, the kind of man who didn't waste words. But when he spoke, there was weight behind it. Raymond quickly came to appreciate Dean's steady presence, and the two fell into a comfortable rhythm, grabbing drinks, talking about sports, fishing, local news, and the sort of everyday things that fill the space between bigger truths. Still, Raymond always sensed there was something about Dean he didn't know. Dean had the worn, sun-baked skin of someone who'd spent a lot of time in the Southwest, and he'd occasionally mention New Mexico, but never in detail. Anytime Raymond gently steered the conversation toward Dean's past, what he did out west, why he left, Dean would simply shake his head and say, "I don't really like talking about it." Raymond respected that. He figured if it ever needed to come out, it would. But the silence around Dean's past only made it all the more haunting. As the years rolled by, Raymond and Dean's friendship deepened. They moved past. Just drinks at Rusty's weekends became filled with early morning fishing trips, Sunday games on the radio, and long silences that only old friends can share without discomfort. Yet, no matter how familiar Dean became, that shadow from his past never lifted. Raymond never stopped wondering why a man who had lived under those vast southwestern skies would willingly trade it all for the gray chill of northern Michigan. Dean never talked about family, never got personal, and whenever New Mexico came up, even just in passing, his eyes would cloud and his voice would drop. It wasn't just what Dean didn't say. It was the way he didn't say it. Raymond began to think of his friend's silence like an abandoned mine sealed off unexplored but still dangerous. There were moments when Dean seemed on the edge of revealing something, when his words caught in his throat and his cigarette burned down untouched. But each time the door shut again. Raymond, for all his curiosity, had the good sense to leave it alone. He figured that kind of silence came from pain, and pain like that doesn't go away just because someone asks. It was a late summer night when everything changed. Raymond and Dean were sitting on the back porch of Raymond's house, the air thick with the scent of pine and the soft hum of crickets. A couple of drinks in, with a steady breeze drifting off Lake Superior, Dean leaned back in his chair, lit a cigarette, and stared out at the darkness. "You ever want to hear a ghost story?" he asked, not looking over. At first, Raymond thought it was just the whiskey talking. Maybe Dean was feeling nostalgic, or maybe he was about to tell some old campfire tale, but the tone in his voice said otherwise. There was no mischief in his words, no grin playing on his lips, just a heavy stillness. "It's not really about ghosts," Dean added, exhaling a long plume of smoke. "At least, not the kind that float around. This one's about why I left New Mexico." For a moment, Raymond didn't respond. He just nodded slowly, sensing that after all those years of silence, Dean was finally ready. It wasn't prying now, it was permission. And so, under that quiet northern sky, with the cicadas humming like static on an old radio, Dean began to speak. His words came slowly at first, like water breaking through a cracked dam. What he told Raymond that night would change the way he saw his friend forever and explain why some ghosts don't haunt places, but people. Dean began with the desert, hot, dry, and endlessly wide. He painted a picture of Guadalupe Basin National Monument in the spring of 1990, a place of red rock spires, empty trails, and long stretches of nothing but wind and sun. Back then, Dean was a park ranger assigned to patrol the western edge of the park. It was mostly quiet work. He'd check trail markers, clean up campsites, watch for vandals or lost hikers. He liked the solitude. After years of city noise and clutter, the silence of the desert felt clean, almost holy. It gave him space to think, to breathe. He said he could walk for miles and not see another soul, just lizards darting between rocks and the occasional shadow of a hawk circling overhead. But one late afternoon, that peace broke. Dean was on foot near a ridge just north of Devil's Gate, a jagged cluster of rocks, known more for its dramatic name than any real danger, when he spotted someone limping toward him from the horizon. The man looked injured, dragging one leg behind him, his movements slow and deliberate. Dean's first instinct, of course, was to help. He called out, waved his arm. But something was wrong. The man didn't look relieved to see him. There was no wave back, no plea for help, just a cold, flat stare that made the hair on Dean's arms stand on end. As Dean approached, the man reached behind his back and pulled a pistol, small, black, and steady, in his hand. Dean stopped dead. He was carrying his own sidearm, standard Ranger issue, but it was holstered and the man already had the drop on him. "Take off your uniform," the man said, voice low and sharp. At first, Dean didn't understand. Then it clicked. The guy wanted to disguise himself as a ranger. Maybe he was running from someone. Maybe the cartel. Maybe the law. Either way, Dean could tell this wasn't a negotiation. The man told him to take off his belt first, make sure he was unarmed. Dean realized if he did that, he wouldn't be walking away. A man like that couldn't afford witnesses. So, Dean stalled, told the guy he was too scared to move, said he couldn't undo the buckle with his hands shaking like they were. It was true in part. His heart was hammering, his mouth dry. The man stepped closer, gun aimed square at his face. Then from somewhere behind them came a low sound like a truck engine in the distance. The man turned his head just for a second. That second was all Dean needed. He lunged low and fast. The gun went off, but the shot missed, sending up a puff of dust. Dean tackled him to the ground. They rolled kicked fists flying. The guy was wiry but strong, and even though he was hurt, he fought like an animal. Dean grabbed the wrist holding the gun, trying to force it away, but the man twisted, trying to get the barrel aimed at Dean's chest. They were locked in a death struggle, tangled in dirt and sweat. Dean didn't have an angle to punch, couldn't wrest the gun free, so he did the only thing he could think of. He clamped his hand over the man's mouth and nose and held it there hard. The man thrashed, panicked, his eyes bulging. Dean kept pressing. He didn't want to kill him, just get the upper hand long enough to take the weapon. But after a minute or so, the man stopped moving. His eyes stayed open, fixed on the empty sky. Dean rolled off, heart pounding, chest heaving. The man still had a pulse, but it was faint. Dean took the gun, made it safe, then radioed for help. A fellow ranger arrived. They got the man back to base, then onto an ambulance. Dean thought it was over, but it wasn't. The man never woke up. No ID, no family. After months in a coma, the hospital pulled the plug. And just like that, the man was gone, and Dean was never the same again. Dean paused after he finished that part of the story, letting the silence stretch between them like a taut wire. Raymond didn't say anything. He couldn't. All he could do was take in the weight of what his friend had just revealed. Dean had taken a life not out of anger or vengeance, but out of sheer survival. And though the authorities had cleared him of any wrongdoing, Dean had never been able to clear himself. The man he suffocated hadn't even had a name, not officially. No wallet, no ID, no matching prints. It was as if he'd come crawling out of the desert with nothing but desperation and a plan. And after a few short weeks of machines keeping his body alive, he had simply faded out of the world. Just a memory, and not even Dean wanted to remember him. But Dean did remember. He remembered everything. The feel of the man's breath under his palm, the wild panic in his eyes, the gunshot echoing through the rocks. He said the nightmares started a few weeks later. Short bursts of sleep, followed by jolts, awake, soaked in sweat. Sometimes he saw the man's face. Sometimes he heard the gun go off again. Only this time, it didn't miss. He started to avoid sleep. He stopped answering calls from fellow rangers. He'd walk through the park during the day and feel eyes on him, always just beyond the trail, just behind the next tree. Rationally, he knew there was no ghost, but the guilt made everything feel haunted. Dean stayed on duty for a few more months, trying to convince himself it would pass. But it didn't. Even after the official report came through justified use of force, he couldn't accept it. He couldn't stand to wear the uniform anymore. It felt like a lie. He tried taking time off, driving out to El Paso for a long weekend, but nothing helped. The weight followed him like a second shadow. So one morning he packed a duffel bag, turned in his badge, and drove north. He didn't tell his family, didn't leave a forwarding address. He just kept driving until the desert turned to forest and the sun-soaked rocks gave way to snow. He didn't stop until he hit the upper peninsula of Michigan, a place as far from New Mexico as he could get without crossing into Canada. Dean never told a soul until that night with Raymond. Sitting under a sky filled with stars, the bottle half gone, the porch creaking under the weight of two old friends and one heavy truth. And for the first time in years, Dean let it breathe. He let it live in the air instead of buried in his chest. But even then, he made it clear he wasn't looking for forgiveness. He wasn't even sure he believed in it anymore. He just needed someone to know. And Raymond listened. After that night on the porch, Dean never spoke of the story again, and Raymond never asked him to. Their friendship returned to its usual rhythm, fishing at sunrise, grabbing beers at Rusty's swapping jokes, and watching the Tigers lose more games than they won. But something had changed. Raymond saw it now, the quiet way Dean would drift into thought when the wind picked up, or how his eyes lingered a second longer on the tree line, like he was waiting for something to appear. The darkness was still there, but it didn't weigh him down in the same way. Maybe telling the story hadn't erased the past, but it gave the pain a place to rest outside of Dean's soul. Raymond never told anyone what Dean shared, not because he was sworn to secrecy, but because it wasn't his to tell. It was like holding a heavy stone that wasn't meant to be passed around. Dean had trusted him with it, and Raymond carried that trust with quiet care. Over time, they grew older, weathered, but steady. Dean built a quiet life in Michigan. No wife, no kids, but a garden in the spring and a fireplace in the fall. He became known around town for helping neighbors with shoveling snow or fixing fences. People liked him. They just didn't know what he'd survived. For Raymond, that night became a kind of turning point. Not because it explained everything about Dean, but because it revealed how much people carry without ever showing it. Everyone has a story they're not ready to tell. And when someone finally does, the best thing you can do isn't offer a solution. It's just to sit beside them, hold the silence, and let them know they're not alone in it. Ethan Miller, a 32-year-old park ranger at Wind Cave National Park in South Dakota, has spent his career navigating the sprawling wilderness of the park. His deep connection with the land and its natural wonders defines his role as both a guide and protector of the park's unique environment. He knows the cave system like the back of his hand, a place that's both captivating and dangerous, where the earth seems to breathe with the shifting air. Ethan's calm demeanor and meticulous nature make him a natural leader, especially when faced with a crisis. David Harris, a 30-year-old experienced caver and adventurer, had come to Wind Cave to explore its mysterious depths. David's passion for cave exploration runs deep, and he's made it his life's mission to uncover the unknown. He's an independent, confident individual, always eager to push his limits and discover something new. However, his curiosity sometimes leads him into situations that are more dangerous than anticipated, as is the case during this particular expedition. His disappearance is not just a tragedy for his family, but also a puzzle that will haunt those who search for him. Liam Carter, David's close friend and fellow hiker, is a 29-year-old with a practical mind and a steady presence. While not as experienced as David in cave exploration, Liam's knowledge of the outdoors and his loyalty to his friends make him a valuable companion. However, the uncertainty of the situation leaves him rattled, especially as he tries to keep calm in the face of mounting fear. His decision to seek help, despite his own fear and exhaustion, reflects the deep bond between him and David, as well as his unwavering sense of responsibility. Together, these three characters represent a mix of expertise, courage, and human vulnerability, setting the stage for a story full of intrigue, danger, and emotional depth. Their differing qualities make them compelling, each playing a crucial role in the unfolding mystery of Wind Cave. Wind Cave National Park, located in the rolling hills of South Dakota, is a place where the earth holds secrets. Spanning over 50 square miles, the park is a stunning blend of dense forests, mixed grass prairie, and rocky hills, making it a haven for wildlife and a treasure trove for natural beauty. But it's the cave system that gives the park its name and its eerie allure. Wind Cave is the largest of its kind in the world, known for its labyrinthine passageways that stretch beneath the Earth's surface. Its unique geological features, more passage volume per cubic mile than any other cave, make it a geological wonder. Despite its vastness, only around 10% of the cave has been explored, leaving thousands of miles of tunnels waiting to be discovered. And with current technology, it's estimated that it will take over 600 years to fully map and explore the cave system. This enigmatic underground world is one that calls to adventurers, scientists, and explorers alike. The Lakota Native Americans who have called this area home for centuries speak of Wind Cave with reverence. To them, the cave is not just a natural wonder. It's a sacred place tied to their creation myths. They refer to the cave as Washanaya, describing it as a living, breathing entity that connects them to the underworld. According to their beliefs, their ancestors crawled out of this very cave during the first days of creation, emerging into the world of the living. This ancient connection between the Lakota people and Wind Cave infuses the area with a sense of mystery and reverence that's hard to ignore. In contrast to its sacred origins, Wind Cave today attracts countless visitors each year, drawn to its beauty, history, and the opportunity to explore the unknown. But the cave also holds danger. Its winding paths, low ceilings, and hidden chambers make it a place where only the most experienced adventurers dare to go deep. It was on a chilly September afternoon in 2003 that this dangerous, unexplored terrain would become the setting for a mystery that would leave its mark on all who were involved. As Ethan Miller, David Harris, and Liam Carter entered this labyrinth, they were not just facing a natural wonder, they were about to encounter something far more unsettling. Their journey would test not just their physical endurance, but their ability to face the unknown and the unpredictable forces of nature. It was late afternoon on a crisp September day when Ethan Miller's phone buzzed, signaling the start of an adventure that would soon become a nightmare. The call came from Liam Carter, David Harris's close friend and hiking partner, and the urgency in his voice was immediate. Liam explained that he and David had been hiking along the Lookout Point Trail near Wind Cave when they saw a lone child sprinting toward the cave entrance. A strange sight given the cave was unstaffed at the time, and the child was all alone. Concerned for the child's safety, both men shouted for him to stop, but the child didn't respond. Instinctively, David, ever the adventurer, decided to follow him into the cave. He reassured Liam that he would be back in just a few minutes. But those few minutes stretched on, and soon Liam found himself alone at the cave's entrance, anxiously calling for David, but hearing nothing in return. Liam's worry quickly turned to fear as the sun began to set, and he realized David had not come back. Unable to find David, and with no way of contacting him deep inside the cave, Liam made the difficult decision to leave the cave running 2 miles to get cell service. The panic was real, and when he finally called 911, his voice was frantic. "My friend is missing in Wind Cave. He went after a child and neither of them has come out." Ethan immediately sprang into action, alerting his supervisor and contacting the park's search and rescue team. By the time he arrived at the entrance to Wind Cave, the team was already preparing to head in. Among them were 2 caving specialists, experts familiar with the labyrinthine passages beneath the park. With Liam at the front growing more agitated with each retelling of the events, the group geared up and headed into the cave. As they crawled into the narrow entrance, the familiar rush of cool air from the cave greeted them, a breath from deep within the earth itself, the cave's unique breathing phenomenon at play. But despite their experience, the team's first few steps were fraught with tension. Every twist and turn in the narrow tunnels led them deeper into a world that felt both alive and hostile. This was no ordinary cave, and Ethan couldn't help but feel a strange sense of foreboding. As the team moved further into the depths, the mystery of David's disappearance began to take on an eerie life of its own. As Ethan and the search and rescue team entered Wind Cave, the weight of their mission was heavy in the air. The familiar scent of damp earth and stone filled their lungs as they began the long descent into the cave's dark, narrow passages. The light from their headlamps flickered against the jagged walls, revealing rock formations that looked like frozen spider webs, delicate yet sharp. The eerie quiet of the cave pressed in on them, broken only by the sound of their movements, shuffling boots on the uneven ground, the soft thud of equipment shifting, and the occasional distant breath of the cave as its underground currents shifted. For Ethan, this was a place he knew intimately, but today it felt different. Today, the cave was no longer just a marvel of nature. It was a maze that could hold untold dangers, and within it, his colleague David was lost. The group moved quickly but cautiously, the tension palpable in every step they took. They followed Liam's lead, who, despite his growing panic, remained determined to find his friend. With each passing moment, Ethan's anxiety grew. The deeper they ventured into the earth, the further they seemed to get from any familiar landmarks. The path David had taken was not on any known map of the cave. It twisted and turned in ways that seemed deliberately elusive, as if the cave itself was trying to swallow them whole. An hour into the search, they found their first clue, a torn piece of blue fabric caught on a jagged rock, likely from the jacket David had been wearing. It was a small piece of evidence, but it sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. It was confirmation that David had gone further into the cave, and now it was clear that he had been in a hurry, perhaps even running. Ethan's mind raced with questions. Had David been chasing the child? Had he gotten lost in the maze of tunnels? Was he hurt? With the caving specialists leading the way, the team crawled deeper into the cave. The passageways were growing tighter, forcing them to maneuver single file with their backpacks, scraping the ceiling. The air was growing thicker, colder, and the familiar rush of wind from the cave's breathing seemed to echo ominously around them. They passed into areas of the cave that had never been fully mapped. The unexplored sections were narrower, darker, and more treacherous. The sound of their breathing grew louder, a constant reminder of how far from safety they truly were. Then came the first real sign of distress, a faint handprint smeared across a rock wall, followed by a boot print in the damp clay. It was enough to confirm that David had indeed been through this area, but it was also a clear indication that time was running out. They were deep now, far from the surface, and the likelihood of finding David alive was becoming slimmer by the minute. As they ventured further into the unknown, every decision became critical. The team was divided into smaller groups to search multiple branches of the cave. Each dark corner of the underground world seemed to hold more secrets, more unanswered questions. Ethan's heart raced as they uncovered more traces of David's journey. A water bottle, a drop of fresh blood on the stone, and more signs of panic. But still, there was no sign of David. By midnight, the team was exhausted. They had descended into a part of the cave so remote that even their radios were useless. They had pushed themselves to the limit, but with every new passage they explored, the feeling of hopelessness grew. Despite the vastness of the cave, it felt as though they were getting nowhere, trapped in an unending loop of narrow corridors and steep inclines. Every step forward seemed to take them further into the unknown, and every turn held the possibility of finding David or finding nothing at all. This wasn't just a search for a missing person. It was a battle against time, the elements, and the very cave itself. And for Ethan, it was becoming a fight to maintain hope in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. As Ethan and the rescue team pressed deeper into the labyrinthine passages of Wind Cave, the cave's oppressive atmosphere grew more intense. The temperature had dropped, and the air felt heavier, almost suffocating, as they continued their search for David Harris. The tight spaces and jagged rocks were starting to take a toll on the team. The narrow tunnels, which had once seemed merely a physical challenge, now felt like a claustrophobic trap, closing in around them with every step. The team's progress slowed, each movement more deliberate as they navigated the labyrinth. Their headlamps flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to dance in the darkness, amplifying the sense of isolation. The eerie breathing of the cave, a natural phenomenon that fluctuates with the pressure of air, inside and outside, seemed louder now. To Ethan, it was a constant reminder of how far they had ventured from the safety of the surface, how deep into the earth they had gone, and how much danger they were in. It wasn't just the cave's physical challenges that weighed heavily on Ethan's mind. It was the growing sense of urgency. Every piece of evidence they found, David's torn jacket, the boot prints in the damp clay, the faint handprint smeared on the rock wall, spoke of someone desperate, someone who had been in a hurry and perhaps in pain. There was a chilling realization now. David wasn't just lost in the cave. He was potentially injured, alone, and running out of time. The deeper they went, the harder it became to shake the feeling that the cave itself was fighting back, pushing them farther away from any hope of finding David alive. Hours passed, and with each one the team's hopes began to fray. As they descended further, the tunnels grew tighter, forcing the group to crawl on their bellies, their backpacks scraping the ceiling as they moved forward. They found more signs that David had been here, but no sign of him. One of the team members tripped on a loose rock, causing a small cascade of stones to tumble down the narrow tunnel. For a moment, the noise seemed to echo endlessly in the vast, oppressive darkness. The sound was unsettling, amplifying their fears. By the time they reached a small chamber with a pool of still water, the air felt thick with tension. The room seemed to stretch on endlessly, but there was still no sign of David. It was a cruel reminder that even in a place as vast and remote as Wind Cave, there were still too many places for him to hide, too many corners left unexplored. The search was taking a toll on everyone mentally and physically. Each new twist in the cave's winding paths felt like another obstacle, another test of their resolve. The sense of danger had become all too real, and Ethan couldn't help but wonder how much longer they could keep searching without facing the truth. The longer they stayed down here, the more perilous it became for them all. As the hours turned into days, the search for David Harris took on a grim tone. Ethan and the rescue team had been crawling through the unforgiving passages of Wind Cave for more than 48 hours, but with every step deeper into the earth, they were met with increasing frustration. The cave's oppressive darkness seemed to wrap around them, swallowing their hope bit by bit. The sounds of their breathing, labored and strained in the tight confines, were the only signs of life in the stifling silence. The flicker of their headlamps barely cut through the inky blackness, casting elongated shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. There was no sign of David, only more troubling evidence that pointed to his increasing distress. A shredded glove, his blood smears on the rock walls, and a faint trail of footprints. Each clue deepened the mystery, but none offered answers. It was as if the cave was both a witness and a participant in David's disappearance, its twisting tunnels holding more secrets than they could uncover. Liam's agitation grew with each passing hour. His initial resolve to help his friend was beginning to crack under the weight of fear and exhaustion. Ethan, though experienced in cave rescues, could see the toll it was taking on Liam. It was hard not to feel the creeping sense of hopelessness that threatened to suffocate them all. Every turn they made in the cave seemed to lead them further away from any possible resolution. They were trapped in a vast subterranean maze with no clear way out, and each new passage they explored seemed just as futile as the last. By the third day, the team was visibly worn out. Their bodies were sore from crawling, their minds clouded by the overwhelming task ahead. The air was stifling thick with the dampness of the cave, and every new twist in the tunnels felt like an obstacle, not a path forward. The physical strain was becoming unbearable, but the mental toll was even worse. It wasn't just the endless hours of searching. It was the fear of what they might find, or worse, what they might never find. The question gnawed at Ethan with growing urgency. Was David still alive? The deeper they ventured, the more likely it seemed that time was running out. The stakes had changed. What started as a straightforward rescue mission had transformed into a desperate life-or-death search. They had crossed into territory where the cave itself felt like an enemy, a dark force pushing them further into the unknown. Ethan's heart raced as he pushed forward, clinging to the sliver of hope that David was still out there, still alive. But as the minutes turned to hours and the days dragged on, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were not just searching for David anymore. They were searching for answers in a place that refused to give them up. On the seventh day, the team's exhaustion was palpable. Their bodies ached from crawling through narrow tunnels, and their minds were clouded with the overwhelming fatigue of days spent searching without rest. The atmosphere in Wind Cave had grown even more oppressive, the air thick with dampness and an unshakable sense of desperation. Despite the team's resolve, each twist and turn in the cave seemed to pull them further away from their goal, and their hope of finding David alive was starting to fade. But Ethan and the rescue team knew they couldn't stop yet. They had come too far, driven by the need to bring David back, not just for his family, but for the memory of the man they all once worked alongside. They pushed onward, venturing deeper into uncharted passages of the cave, where the walls seemed to close in around them with every step. The low crawl spaces and jagged rocks had become a relentless obstacle, each movement exhausting them further. Yet they kept going. Every small discovery, more blood, a boot print, signs of David's passage, felt like both a triumph and a curse. Each clue confirmed he had been there, but the deeper they went, the less hope they had of finding him alive. It was in a small, tight chamber where they found the last disturbing clue. Frantic claw marks scraped into the rock as if David had tried to claw his way out in his final moments. It was the last straw. Ethan's heart sank as the realization set in. David was gone, but still, they searched as though by finding him, they could undo the horror of the last 7 days. The discovery of a lone hiking boot weeks later buried in the silt confirmed the bitter truth: Wind Cave had claimed him. The search was over, but the emotional toll remained. The team had ventured as far as they could, but in the end, the cave had remained silent, holding on to its secrets forever. The search for David Harris had ended, but the emotional and psychological impact on Ethan and the rest of the team was far from over. The cave, with its labyrinthine tunnels and its silence, had taken its toll on them all. For Ethan, it wasn't just the physical exhaustion or the mental fatigue of endless hours spent navigating tight, dark passageways. It was the haunting realization that despite all their efforts, they hadn't been able to save David. The eerie quiet of the cave still echoed in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in the darkness, just as David must have felt during his last moments. The discovery of David's hiking boot weeks later, buried in the silt, sealed the painful truth: Wind Cave had claimed him. It was a bitter moment for everyone involved. The cave, once a place of fascination and awe, now felt like a suffocating force, its mysteries and dangers forever etched into the memories of those who had ventured so deeply within. While the physical search had ended the emotional search, the quest for closure was far from over. Ethan continued his work as a park ranger, but each time he entered the cave, there was an unspoken weight on his shoulders. The sense of loss and the lingering questions about what truly happened to David would never fully leave him. For Liam, the emotional toll was even greater. His fear and panic, which had been palpable throughout the search, gave way to grief and guilt. He wondered if he could have done more, if he could have somehow saved his friend. The unanswered questions of the cave, its cold, unyielding silence, would continue to haunt him. In the end, the cave had claimed its secret, and David's story became a part of the wind, whispered through the tunnels, and carried by the cave's breath, an eternal reminder of the dangers hidden beneath the surface of the world we know. For as long as Mark Ellison could remember, the wilderness had always felt like home. Raised just outside Duluth, Minnesota, he spent much of his childhood under a canopy of pine trees or waist-deep in lake water with a fishing pole in hand. His father, a high school science teacher and passionate outdoorsman, made it a family ritual to go camping, fishing, and hiking nearly every summer weekend. They visited places like Grand Portage Pipestone and the St. Croix River, where Mark learned how to build a fire, read animal tracks, and tie the kind of knots that could hold up in a storm. But it was one trip in particular that changed everything for him, their first visit to Voyageurs National Park when he was 9 years old. It wasn't the grandeur of the lake or the quiet beauty of the forest that captured Mark's imagination that day. It was a man, an on-duty U.S. park ranger. The ranger stood at the end of a wooden dock in a crisp green uniform, wide-brimmed Smokey Bear hat, casting a shadow across his sun-weathered face. His badge gleamed in the summer light, and his utility belt looked like something out of a survivalist's dream. To Mark, he didn't just look like someone who belonged in the wild, he looked like someone who could command it. As the ranger exchanged a few friendly words with Mark's father, young Mark watched in silent awe. In that moment, the image of a life lived among the trees and trails, helping others and protecting the land, became more than a childhood daydream. It became a mission. From then on, he begged his parents to stop at ranger stations wherever they traveled. He started collecting park maps, memorizing trail routes, and reading everything he could about forest conservation. On his 11th birthday, he wore a Smokey Bear hat, so big it slipped over his ears, but he wore it proudly. In his heart, the path had already begun. By the time Mark Ellison hit high school, his childhood fascination with park rangers had matured into a focused ambition. While his classmates dreamt of sports scholarships or tech startups, Mark kept his eyes on the trail, literally and figuratively. He volunteered with the local parks department, spending weekends cleaning up riverbanks, repairing signage, and helping guide youth hikes through Minnesota's northern forests. He'd memorized the key species of voyageurs by the time he was 15 and could identify dozens of bird calls by sound alone. To him, ranger work wasn't about prestige, it was about purpose. When it came time to choose a college major, environmental science was the natural path. He enrolled at the University of Minnesota, where he dug deep into courses on ecology, wildlife management, and land use policy. But he quickly learned that a degree alone wouldn't get his foot in the federal door. The National Park Service hiring process was notoriously competitive, especially for full-time ranger positions. So Mark leaned into experience. Every summer, he took on seasonal jobs in parks across the Midwest. He was a trail maintenance worker in Badlands National Park, then a visitor services assistant at Isle Royale. These roles taught him the practical side of ranger work, how to manage people, fix busted trail markers, and defuse tense situations with lost or frustrated hikers. By the time he graduated, Mark had a resume thick with field experience certifications in water safety and backcountry survival, and letters of recommendation from senior rangers who respected his work ethic and calm under pressure. The day he got the email inviting him to the NPS interview panel felt surreal, like everything had finally aligned. He passed the physical, aced the situational assessments, and cleared the background check. And when the call came offering him his first post, Mark stood frozen for a full minute. The assignment, Voyageurs National Park, the very place where his journey had begun. Mark's first few months at Voyageurs National Park were everything he had hoped for, and more. The dense forests, glistening lakes, and intricate waterways he'd once explored as a child were now his daily reality. It felt like stepping into the pages of a childhood dream, except this time he was wearing the uniform. The badge on his chest didn't just shine, it meant something. It was a symbol of years of hard work, determination, and the fulfillment of a promise he'd made to himself years ago on that wooden dock. But reality, Mark quickly learned, didn't always match the postcard-perfect image. The work was demanding. He pulled long shifts, monitored remote trails, responded to distressed calls, and conducted water safety inspections in unpredictable weather. It was equal parts law enforcement, environmental stewardship, and community service. Still, he thrived. Helping lost hikers find their way back, educating families on wildlife safety, and protecting fragile ecosystems gave him a deep sense of purpose. Not every day was peaceful, though. In the summer of 1997, Mark helped locate an elderly hiker who had gone missing for 2 days, an ordeal that left the woman shaken and her family in tears. A month later, he pulled a struggling child out of X Bay after the boy fell from a kayak without a life vest. Incidents like these reminded him that while the park was beautiful, it could also be dangerous. Still, with each challenge, Mark felt more rooted in the role he had once only imagined. Late in the summer of 1998, as the days began to shorten and the first hints of autumn whispered through the treetops, Mark Ellison's sense of familiarity with Voyageurs National Park had grown into quiet confidence. After more than a year on the job, he knew the back trails better than most maps. The winding coves of Black Bay, the rocky inlets, the shadowed woods each had become as familiar to him as the streets of his hometown. But even the most seasoned ranger knows in the wild complacency is dangerous. And on one particular afternoon, Mark would learn just how quickly the familiar could turn unrecognizable. It started like any other day. Mark was on foot patrol near the Black Bay Trail Loop, checking for signs of illegal camping or hunting nothing out of the ordinary. The sun was high and bright, the forest alive with the chirps of warblers and the soft rustle of late summer wind. He'd done this loop 100 times. But just as he was circling back toward the ranger station, something stopped him cold. It was a sound low, broken, and unmistakably human. A groan, the kind that didn't come from any animal Mark knew. He paused instinctively, reaching for his radio, his heartbeat climbing as the groan came again, this time louder. He called out, "Hello, do you need help?" No answer, just the slow dragging of something through brush. With caution and a hand near his sidearm, he stepped off the trail into the undergrowth. That's when he saw him. At first, Mark didn't know if it was a person or something else entirely. A man barely recognizable as one stumbled forward through the trees about 30 yards ahead. His clothing hung in tatters, burned and shredded beyond reason. His skin was a gruesome patchwork of blackened flesh and raw, oozing wounds. Blood streaked across his chest. One eye was swollen shut, the other stared ahead wide and wild. He wasn't just hurt, he was dying. For a moment, Mark froze. He had seen broken limbs, dehydration, even a gunshot wound once, but this was different. This man looked like he'd been through a firestorm. Then, as if to snap him out of it, the man let out a soft sob and fell to his knees, reaching a charred hand forward and whispering, "Help. I'm not supposed to be here." That was enough. Mark surged forward and dropped to his knees beside him, calling in for emergency medical support on his handheld radio. He didn't dare touch the man, his injuries were too severe, but he knelt close and kept talking to him, trying to offer whatever comfort he could. Minutes later, another ranger, Tom Walker, arrived on an ATV with a medical skid attached. Together, they gently loaded the man onto the gurney, Mark still talking, still trying to keep the man conscious. Back at the outpost, Ranger Emily Rhodes met them with a first aid kit in hand, her face turning ghost pale at the sight. They did everything they could, gauze saline wet cloths to cool the burns, but the man's body was failing fast. He barely spoke again, just shallow breaths and pained winces. When the helicopter arrived 40 minutes later, Mark stood outside the log station watching the rotors blur the sky. He didn't move until the chopper disappeared over the tree line. It wasn't until later that night that they got word the man had died en route to the hospital. No ID, no personal belongings, no known next of kin. Just a burned, broken body and a single cryptic sentence, "I'm not supposed to be here." That sentence haunted Mark. So did the silence of the woods, the scent of burnt skin, and the image of that man staggering through the trees. In the days that followed, he retraced every step along that trail, searching for signs, a campfire gone wrong, a scorched tree, anything to explain it. There was nothing. No ash, no fuel residue, no trampled path, no evidence that anyone else had even been there. Just untouched forest. What made it worse was the boots. When the coroner's report came in, it noted that the man had been wearing a pair of old U.S. Park Ranger boots, standard issue from the 1940s. Mark recognized them from training manuals he'd studied during his academy days. They hadn't been manufactured in over 50 years. The man had no name, no records, no explanation, and no one ever came forward to claim him. In a park that Mark thought he knew inside and out, he was suddenly faced with something that didn't fit something that felt wrong. It wasn't just the death tragic as it was the way the forest seemed to have absorbed it, swallowed it up, and offered no answers. Mark had always believed the woods could be dangerous, but never inexplicable. Until now. The hours after the helicopter disappeared were a blur of silence, antiseptic, and unanswered questions. The small ranger station, normally filled with the quiet chatter of staff checking radio logs or sorting gear, had fallen into a heavy, almost sacred stillness. Mark Ellison stood in the same spot where the burned man had lain just hours before, staring down at the stained medical table. The scent of scorched flesh still clung to the air like a warning. No one said much because there wasn't much to say. They had done everything right, and still it hadn't been enough. Mark replayed the man's final moments over and over in his head, the plea for help, the disoriented gaze, and that last haunting sentence, "I'm not supposed to be here." It gnawed at him. He'd spent years training for worst-case scenarios, falls frostbite, even forest fires. But this didn't have a category. No one knew where the man had come from, and worse yet, no one could explain how he'd ended up in the middle of an untouched stretch of protected wilderness, looking like he'd barely escaped an inferno. And the boots. Mark couldn't stop thinking about the boots. The coroner's report had arrived by fax 2 days later. Cause of death: severe burns, likely 3rd degree over more than 60% of the body. Time of injury uncertain. No identification, no scars, no tattoos, no medical implants, nothing to trace him back to a life. Except for those boots, scuffed and soot-stained, but unmistakably authentic. Mark had seen photos of the same model in a 1947 park ranger training manual, the kind they used to issue post-World War II. They hadn't been made in decades. The stitching, the brass eyelets, the thick leather soles, they were real. And they made no sense at all. Had someone found them in an antique shop and worn them for fun? But why into a remote part of Voyageurs? Why with no gear, no supplies, no vehicle, and no way out? And how had he been burned so badly with no evidence of fire in the area? Mark found himself digging into trail camera footage, checking old incident reports, anything that might provide context, but came up empty every time. It was the kind of mystery that didn't just challenge Mark's training. It rattled the foundation of what he believed about the world he thought he knew. Mark Ellison wasn't the kind of man to jump to wild conclusions. His training as a ranger had taught him to rely on facts patterns and process to seek evidence before forming a theory. But in the weeks that followed the death of the burned stranger, even the facts refused to make sense. The Minnesota State Patrol had taken over the investigation, and Mark was called into the superintendent's office not long after. Superintendent Bill Hargrove, a no-nonsense Vietnam vet who'd worked in the service for decades, looked unusually unsettled as he relayed what little the troopers had found or hadn't. There were no DNA matches in any database, no missing persons reports aligned with the man's appearance, and the coroner hadn't been able to identify what caused the burns. It wasn't a campfire, it wasn't gasoline, it wasn't electrical or chemical. The burns were deep, severe, and consistent with exposure to extreme heat, but the source remained unknown, and the boots. That was the strangest detail of all. The trooper on the case had dug through archival procurement logs and confirmed that the boots were genuine NPS issue from 1947. The implication was bizarre. Had this man been hiding in the park for decades? Was it some elaborate prank or an old uniform from a collector? The questions kept stacking up, and none had answers. Rangers combed the area again, looking for signs, any sign of a campsite, scorched trees, even tire tracks. Nothing. It was as if the man had simply walked out of the woods from another time. Despite the official case being closed as a John Doe fatality, the mystery lingered in the air like smoke that refused to clear. For Mark, it became more than a professional puzzle. It was personal now. The woods he once felt so sure of had become unfamiliar. And somewhere deep in his gut, a voice was whispering something he didn't want to admit. Maybe this wasn't just an unsolved case. Maybe it was a warning. In the months that followed, Mark Ellison did his best to return to routine checking permits, leading educational hikes, coordinating trail maintenance, but the forest had changed for him. Or rather, his perception of it had. The once familiar paths now carried a subtle weight, a sense that something was always just beyond the tree line. He found himself avoiding the Black Bay Loop altogether, even when he had valid reasons to patrol it. Colleagues noticed he was quieter, more withdrawn. He'd always been steady and thoughtful, but now there was a guarded edge to him, as if some part of him had been singed along with the stranger who stumbled out of the woods that day. He began spending more time alone in his ranger cabin, often staring out at the dark treetops long after he should have been asleep. At night, when the wind rattled the siding or a branch cracked underfoot, his mind would conjure the groan he'd first heard on the trail, that low human moan of someone in unspeakable pain. He told no one about the dreams. In them, the man walked again, eyes still bloodshot, reaching out, whispering, "I'm not supposed to be here." The rational part of Mark tried to bury it. He read scientific articles on rare combustion accidents, studied historical cases of burn victims found in remote areas. But none of it soothed the deep discomfort now rooted in his bones. Something was wrong. He just didn't know what. Mark Ellison retired from the National Park Service in 2018, 2 decades after the stranger emerged from the forest and changed everything he thought he knew about the wilderness he once called home. He bought a modest house just outside Duluth, hoping the distance from voyageurs would help him move on. But the quiet didn't bring peace. Most nights, he sat on his porch with a thermos of coffee, staring out at the tree line, as if waiting for the past to reappear. He never spoke about the burned man publicly, not in ranger newsletters, not at retirement parties. It felt too strange, too personal. Still, the questions never left him. He began researching local lore, poring through archives and logging company records, even studying maps of the land before it became a national park. Nothing. No reported fires, no missing ranger from 1907. But what he did find unsettled him further. In 2009, the homestead building at Barker Ranch, where Charles Manson had once hidden, had burned down in Death Valley National Park under mysterious circumstances. There had been no lightning, no known cause, and the rangers there, like Mark, had found no answers. Maybe the forests and deserts hold on to things we can't explain. Maybe not everything that walks out of the woods is meant to be found. Mark doesn't pretend to know anymore, but he still hears the wind at night and wonders, not about what happened, but about what might still be out there. Drawn to eerie, true stories, unexplained mysteries, and chilling experiences from deep within America. Support the channel by hitting like, subscribe, and turning on the notification bell so we can keep exploring more real-life tales. Stories from remote forests and forgotten places where even science falls silent. Every subscription is a powerful push for me to keep telling the stories that few dare to share. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.